Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Contemporary Art Taos 2020, the Artist Interview Series. This series consists of short interviews between myself and our featured artists and will be released twice a month for the duration of the show on Facebook Live. Today, joining us is Lynnette Haozous. Thank you, Lynnette, for being here. How are you doing?
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Great. Well, surrounding us, behind us, and above us is your work, Braiding Reconciliation, which is probably it's definitely our biggest install for this exhibition. So you are Chiricahua Apache of the San Carlos Apache Tribe, Dine, and Taos Pueblo. Can you tell us how growing up on and around your three tribes' reservations in Arizona and New Mexico has influenced your work as an artist?
Yeah. Well, like you said, I'm Chiricahua Apache from San Carlos, Arizona, an enrolled member over there. And I'm also Dine and Taos Pueblo. And so growing up, I grew up in and around my three reservations and tribes and cultures. And growing up and experiencing them really gave me a rich sense of cultural pride and identity. And that definitely reflects in my art today. But also, it also made me reflect and think about the intersectionalities of our tribes, especially about our current struggles and, you know, our sacred sites and our identities as well. So it's definitely all mixed in a beautiful mesh of cultures. And, you know, I think about the intersectionalities and what each tribe is going through. And in my art, I like to do a lot of social justice work. And so in a lot of indigenous tribes and in Indian country are going through so much stuff right now, you know, from policy work to environmental work to sacred sites to just identity and rights. And just as human beings right now, our survival is of the utmost importance. So in my art, I like to reflect that about what's going on in our indigenous societies, the histories, and also give a sense of pride of that we're still here and that representation for other indigenous artists and the next generations too. So definitely mixing it all together and trying to formulate some sort of representation for all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this work has special significance for Taos history. The work called Braiding Reconciliation consists of the rope sculpture above me and the mural work behind me. Can you walk us through the significance and the symbolism in the materials you use, the ropes, the colors of the mural?
Yeah. Well, this is called Braiding Reconciliation. And this is actually an honoring and remembering piece to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And the piece above me actually is the rope piece that you see, but it's consisted of different fibers made of rope. And that represents the rope used by the Pueblo Revolt runners of 1680. And going back to the history of Taos Pueblo and this area here upon which we are now, Taos Pueblo territory, this represents also not only an ode to the Pueblo Revolt, but also a vision of healing for both communities, of the Pueblo communities and the Hispano communities around here, because we have so much history and culture and pride, but also a lot of trauma. And so I felt that there was a real need, especially now, with the coming down of all these monuments, conquistador monuments, to make a vision of what may replace it instead of something that tears people apart, but rather creates something that gets the dialogue going and maybe some form of reconciliation. And that word is a little tricky sometimes because reconciliation is really unending. I believe it. You know, there's not going to be a point where these communities are really, it's going to be reconciled fully. but it's an active, and when I say active, continuously active process that both communities need to cooperate in and be a part of. So this piece, more about the history, the Pueblo Revolt, 1680, it's an ode to the yucca rope that the Pueblo runners had. And during the revolt, I'll talk a little bit more about the rope itself. But during the revolt, the Pueblo runners, they had these cords of yucca rope, and in them, they had knots in the yucca rope. And these runners went from each Pueblo and ran with these cords to each of these Pueblos all the way down. And these ropes signified a code, and the code was the number in the knots. The number of knots represented the days until the revolt. And so as these Pueblo runners carried this secret message of the day that they were going to revolt, it was very secretive, and they were very important to the organizing of Pueblo people here. And so that was the code, and that's what these knots represent in this installation here. And so as each Pueblo had the cord and received the yucca rope, they added a knot into it to signify that they were in and that they were a part of it, to continue to fight for our survival. And so I could be here to tell this story about what we had to do. And in that was the history of that, and that was the significance of this cord, this rope, and the knots in this rope and installation. But also, this whole installation came from a result of current happenings with a lot of the Abolish the Entrada movement as well, which we can get into in a little bit. But that was a result of this, was thinking of a new future in healing, and how do we, if we're taking down monuments, what should we replace them with? And what would the people be proud of? And what would really help healing of our communities? And so talking more about this rope, it was actually a collaboration with other Native artists from different Pueblos and Hispano artists as well. And the Hispano artists created the corn husk as a form of rope, and also offered their wool. And so we made the wool and the corn husk into rope. And so that is actually a part of their culture, intertwining with our cultures and creating these knots of reconciliation. And so they have that side, and then we have the yucca cords, which I made as well, the yucca rope, and then the modern day rope fibers of Manila rope too. So it's these meshing of cultures coming together to signify a healing. And I think in actually making and having these different cultures and different artists from different backgrounds within New Mexico come together, it was an actual active process of like community engagement, not only with the artists, but with our community, to actually signify that physically that we are taking process in this healing and trying to create something, a dialogue at least.
Can you talk to us about the mural? The structure that you see, the colors and their significance?
Right. So the mural itself is based upon Pueblo pottery motif, particularly northern Taos Pueblo pottery. You'll see a lot of these flowers, and especially the color scheme is very more old style, and the flowers are also a part of that too. And they symbolize the flower of life. And of course, each Pueblo has their own significance in these designs and patterns, and some of them we hold sacred. So I keep them as that, and also, you know, I put my own contemporary spin on them too. And so that's kind of what's happening here. And it just represents, the stack represents like the Pueblo and the culture itself. And then like I kind of think of it as the flower of life coming out and sprouting around this whole space of healing, and just trying to encompass this space in a good light feeling as well.
I think it's very effective at that. So you sort of touched on my next question, but a version of this work was originally shown at the Institute of American Indian Arts in an exhibition responding to the 2018 monumental decision by the Santa Fe Fiesta Council and the Caballeros de Vargas to discontinue La Entrada, a 20th century pageant that inaccurately portrayed the reconquest of Santa Fe. The exhibition included Native American and Indo-Hispano artists to create work around the theme of reconciliation. Tell us about your involvement in that. I mean, the decision to end La Entrada came after years and years of activist and advocacy movements. How did you come to be involved in that?
Yeah, well, that kind of goes back to growing up here in Taos Pueblo and in the community. I grew up here on Taos Pueblo Reservation. My grandpa is Jimmy K. Lujan from Taos Pueblo. And I grew up going to the Taos Pueblo Day School, to the junior high, and being in the school system and within the communities, experiencing the fiestas up here, and seeing the reenactment and their versions of the Entrada and the reconquest and the peaceful reconquest always struck a chord with me, because they would come into our schools and reenact the Entrada, and these conquistadors would come into our class and reenact the conquest of our Pueblo people, and it was just so bad and horrible to see, but also very uncomfortable as one of the few indigenous people in class here up in northern New Mexico. But it really, I never could really understand, you know, I didn't know too much history back then until I got older, and realized what they were reenacting, more like retelling of their own version of what happened. And that really, once I got to know what was happening, and it really, you know, struck a chord with me when the recent movement of indigenous female organizers here in New Mexico, Pueblo indigenous women, started organizing protests and a movement to abolish the Entrada, especially within these last 5 years, really going hard to get, you know, the city to abolish it. And so as that grew, escalation at the Entradas of violence happened during the protests. And I think it was in 2017, during the Fiesta Entrada protest, the women organizers of the movement were met with police brutality and violence, to the point where they, you know, roughed them up and marched them down the plaza like they would do our warriors back in the day, as an example, and marched them through the plaza to get ridiculed by the Entrada crowd. And so that is definitely goes into these reenactments and why it's so important to abolish these monuments and things that celebrate genocide and the erasure of our histories and our cultures. The one thing that why we had a problem with the Entrada was the retelling of history, the denying of the Pueblo revolt, and the whole reenactment during the fiestas. The Entrada would come in with the reenactment with the conquistadors, and they would have Native people dressed up in red face, or people playing Native people dressed up in red face. And those would be the peaceful natives, and that would be the peaceful reconquest. That would be the reenactment. And it's wrong in general, but it also makes it seem like the reconquest was peaceful and there was no Pueblo revolt 2-3 times after that. And we're still trying to reconcile from all of that right now, all of our communities. And so that was really important to make sure that histories are being told in the right way from, especially now, oppressed voices and communities. And so as the violence and the protests picked up, the mayor of Santa Fe decided to abolish the entrada. And as we can see now, it's unfortunate that violence had to happen for change to come, but now we have the coming down of conquistador monuments and more monuments that are considered racist. And now we have the question of what do we put in replace of that? What can heal our communities as well?
Oh, what a powerful story. I was totally unaware it was really led by Indigenous women.
Yeah.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, they are some powerful women indeed. And, you know, that was just one thing of a whole list of more things that need to be done here in New Mexico.
I notice you keep talking about monuments and the significance of monuments, and you know, you working in mural work doesn't seem like an accident. You're in a lot of ways creating a new version of a monument that sort of acts as a place for racial healing. Is that your objective?
Well, I've never really thought of my murals as monuments, but I definitely create things with the intention to heal and to create dialogue, at least, if anything, to create something that will continue the dialogue forward and get people talking and just have that ripple effect. And keep it in our consciousness as well, because we live in such a trendy society. So many things come and go. So I think also making this was to remember that, what our Indigenous women and community members did that day and their sacrifice, but also, you know, just to try to keep it moving forward on this momentum of bigger things can come from this as well. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, public art does have a lot of issues of context to think about, right? It's going to be in a city square. It's going to be, you know, in a place where everyone is experiencing it. It's the same for being in a museum. You know, now that you're in a museum, we're dealing with a lot of similar issues about who's telling the story.
Right.
And it's a responsibility of museums to be conscious in our role of the creation and retelling of history, especially as museums have often not included non-white or non-colonizing voices. And in doing so, we've contributed to an erasure of many narratives. And a lot of museums are reckoning with that right now, and how we fix that in our collections, our exhibitions, our education programs. So as an artist and an advocate, do you have any thoughts on how museums can be part of the redefinition of space for recovery, for healing, for transcendence?
Definitely. I think it starts with seeking consultation and collaboration. Really a revamping of museums' values, really, mission statements. It's not enough to say we've diversified by including a couple artists, Native, people of color artists in a show. It really would be more impactful to have at the highest level representation. And that means revamping museums in whole, from staffs to curators to boards. We really need to have representation, because at the highest levels, because it's not enough anymore just to be an artist represented in a show. It needs to be at all levels at this point. And I think that also it's really good to see a lot of museums revamping and rethinking, you know, their relationships to their collections, and more of thinking of not like owners of these objects and sacred items, but as custodians, that they have a responsibility to, with the permission of the indigenous people and the owners, to take care of them. But they also have a responsibility to listen to the calls of repatriation and to the indigenous peoples, the owners, that have made the descendants of these objects as well, and really listen to those people about what they want to do and respect those wishes as well. So there's a lot of, I think museums are more listening to what decolonization in a museum would look like. And there's still a lot of work to be done, but I feel like the more people that are opening the eyes, especially now in our current society and mindset of the society, I think the time is now to revamp, and this is the opportunity to rethink these institutions and what they mean, and our relationships, the museum's relationships to the communities around them as well. So I think seeking consultation and collaboration is probably my best advice at this point that I can pinpoint.
I really appreciate that feedback. I love this shift that you mentioned about not thinking about everything in our collection as an object we own, but us as caretakers. It is such a rooted in colonizing attitudes to think this is mine, now I have it, which is just not the truth of these objects, of these artworks. So I'm so appreciative for you sharing that opinion and that advice.
Thank you.
So Lynnette, thank you so much for being with us. It's been such a pleasure to do this interview with you, and thank you all for joining us on Facebook Live. Stay tuned for our next interview, which will air on March 31st with Monique Belize.